everybody. Welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for all of the very warm and loving messages I received from you guys when I had my health issue, a bit of a health scare. As you may know, last week I had a sore throat while teaching, and unfortunately, that sore throat developed into some kind of bacterial infection, potentially strep. And I'm still taking an antibiotic treatment. And luckily, by now, I still am a bit raspy, excuse me, but the swelling has gone away and I should be just fine. So thank you everybody for sending me such incredibly kind and warm messages. I try to respond to as many as I could. I am currently not at home. I am in Washington. I'm in DC. Although, strictly speaking, I'm actually in Virginia. I'm on the outskirts of Washington visiting family. And today I'm going to be hosting a 45-minute lecture for your and my pleasure on the Kantian notion of freedom. We're going to talk about freedom, philosophy in relationship to freedom. And along the way, we're going to talk about some other things. I want to talk a little bit more about the John Wick movie that I saw, which has some really interesting ideas that are distinctly Kantian. That's something I want to cover here. Um, I see some comments already telling me where you're joining us from. That makes me very happy. I see Boston. Hello. Good morning, Boston. Please do leave a comment letting me know where you're joining us from. That gives me so much joy. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be able to share this space with you on a Monday morning. So please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining us from. I should also say a huge thank you to all the patrons who keep this project alive and well. If you'd like to download the audio for all of these lectures, and I've been teaching them now for more than 2 years, you can find that on Patreon. Plus, as a patron, you get access to a whole bunch of community features, like a community exclusive podcast Q&A that I record after each and every class, a kind of bonus session. So if you're interested in becoming a patron, please go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. I see someone from Kiev. Hello, Kiev. Hope that you are well. Germany, Philippines. Apologies about my voice again. I'm just recovering from an infection. Jordan. Hello, Jordan. Australia. That's incredible. Iran. That's so wild. Thailand. That's incredible. Makes me so happy. Italy. Hi there. Bolivia. That's so cool. Algeria. It's crazy. I feel so incredibly blessed that I get to host these classes for people around the world. And yes, for those of you asking, I am feeling so much better. Last week I was in legit, genuine pain. It felt like having like razor blade cuts down my throat. I could barely swallow. And I'm really glad I went on antibiotics because the doctor said that if I hadn't, that I may have well needed to go to the ER because my throat was like constricting so bad. The next stage would have been hard to breathe. So thankfully that did not happen. Thankfully I'm here. I'm so glad that we haven't missed a single class. So that's great. Hello, Turkey, merhaba. All right, today I want to talk about a whole bunch of things, but the basic concept today is going to be talking about freedom and freedom from a Kantian perspective. For those of you who are new to this project, this is a weekly introduction to philosophy and theory, by which I mean quote unquote continental philosophy and quote unquote critical / psychoanalytic theory that I've been hosting for many years now. The basic backstory, if you're curious, is that I used to be working as an academic, as a lecturer, which is the UK equivalent of an assistant professor in America or North America, at the University of Oxford Brookes. And then the pandemic happened. And when the pandemic happened, we had no in-class teaching. And so I decided to start teaching online for free, basically to just host lectures on Instagram. Back then we had about 8 students, all of whom I knew in person, and it was open access. It was free for everybody. And since then, we've just slowly added new people to our group. And the basic premise, this is my very strong belief, like this is my dream, if you will, is that it is possible to make philosophy and theory accessible to people around the world in a way that builds community, that strengthens values, that helps people educate themselves in a way that isn't just content, that doesn't just dumb everything down to a soundbite. And really, it's just been this massive experiment in public facing open access education. And I'm so, so grateful that we're still here. I'm so grateful that you guys have made this a reality. I know this is a long intro, so I should probably start. Okay, taps pencil on desk. By the way, if you're curious, I'm staying at a distant relative, but a very good friend of mine who is also a very accomplished martial arts person. And this is his basement. And in the room next door, there's an entire like jujitsu training room. And he's trying to teach me some basic defensive maneuvers, as it were. Okay, so I want to talk today a little bit about the idea of freedom and the Kantian notion of freedom and what kind of implications it has for Slavoj Žižek's interpretation of Hegel and so on and so forth. Now, I want to start with an argument that Slavoj Žižek makes about Kant that I think is super interesting. So one of Kant's basic well-known maxims is "Du kannst, denn du sollst," which is usually translated as "you can because you must." Now, Žižek has an interesting twist on this. He says, what if we translated it slightly differently? What if instead of translating "Du kannst, denn du sollst" into "you can because you must," what if we translated into "you can because you cannot not do"? Now, on the face of it, this seems like a standard Žižekian inversion, something like saying "I would prefer not to" instead of saying "I don't want to do it," which for those of you who have taken my classes know there's more than just a grammatic difference, namely the affirmation of a predicate, "I would prefer not to," thereby affirms a form of non-action rather than the simple negation of action. And something similar happens here as well with Žižek's translation of Kant. Žižek's translation of Kant's maxim about freedom, namely the imperative is not "you can because you must," but "you can because you cannot not do," can actually be put in terms of something that I saw in the latest John Wick movie. There's a scene from the John Wick movie that kind of perfectly encapsulates this Kantian notion of freedom, which is therefore intrinsically attached to the notion of duty. And I don't want to spoil it too much, but there's a sequence in the new John Wick movie in which two people are engaged in combat. It's sort of a life and death combat scenario in which neither of them want to participate. They're both being forced into it. One of them is being compelled into this fight by means of the high table, by means of an oath that he has taken. He is also being compelled to do this because his family is under threat. The other one is being compelled to do it because honor decrees it, because he is defending a friend. And so we have we have one character defending a family member and another one defending a friend. And both of them are friends. They're fighting each other and they don't want to do it. Now, from a Kantian perspective, this is precisely the most free act possible. To do something which you don't want to do, and yet you embrace the necessity of having to do it. In this case, they are honor bound to fight each other to the death. And there's a key moment here, which is that at the end of this encounter between these two master fighters, in which one of them is being killed, the daughter, in classic sort of anime fashion, right? The daughter of the father who has just been killed wants to essentially revenge him and wants to continue the fight. And at this exact moment, the opponent says, "This is not your fight. You don't have to do this." Now, that might appear like a standard action movie cliche, but it's actually a really compelling idea about the notion of freedom. If the notion of freedom is embracing the necessity of being compelled to act, in other words, to act in a manner as if you had no choice, then the woman in this moment has a choice to make, the choice whether or not she embraces a narrative of revenge in which she defends the father, or she honors the battle that has just taken place and lets it stand in its own right. In other words, if she were to fight the killer of her father, she would do it on her own terms at another time. This is more than just a movie standard cliche. This is a distinctly philosophical problem about the nature of freedom and the nature of choosing your own battles and choosing your own burdens. Now, I want to take it a step back for a moment to lay out some of the pieces that gets Kant to this maxim, du kannst, denn du sollst, and then we'll come back to the movie a couple times in a way that will hopefully make sense. Now, one thing that's really important to note is that there's usually two ways in which people interpret Kant. There's the more, let's say, analytic way of interpreting Kant, which is to essentially argue that Kant is the last thinker who makes sense, the last rational thinker before we succumb to the supposed metaphysical madness of Hegel, an attitude which is still prevalent among certain analytic circles today, although not all. And then there's the more continental, more Žižekian approach to Hegel, which sees Hegel as actually continuing or radicalizing some of the ontological problems that Kant raises. Now, what's key here is that we have two opposing viewpoints on the nature of Kant's discovery, Kant's so-called Copernican turn or insight. Essentially, it works like this. The naive attitude towards Kant ascribes to Kant a naive transcendentalism, which is to say, Kant essentially posits that there's an unknowable X, an absolute transcendental horizon that cannot be known by man. And therefore, in a sense, we are lost. Because after all, if the Kantian inquiry is into the conditions by which pure reason might be achieved, Kant essentially argues that the antinomies would be the paradoxical instance by which reason is itself, by which the absolute is itself conceptualized into reason. To put that a little bit more simply, essentially Kant says we can't know this unknowable X. There is no transcendental knowledge possible. This is what you will see online as the meme, which is the can't touch this or can't touch this. That's the kind of slightly more naive way of interpreting Kant, that Kant essentially resigns himself to saying that we can't know the transcendental absolute, that truth or pure reason is an impossibility in and of itself. But if you look at Kant, this is not really reflected in the text. Instead, there's a beautiful passage in which Kant actually says that if we were to know the absolute, if we were to reach some kind of pure knowing of an absolute transcendental horizon, then we would no longer be free. In a sense, and he writes this very literally, he writes, we would become mere puppets. We would become like automata, like robots, dancing to the tune of some kind of preordained, a destiny for ourselves. And that, in a sense, and this is where Kant is, of course, already a little bit psychoanalytic avant la lettre, and you can understand why Žižek becomes so interested in making an analysis that combines the Kantian insight or the Kantian Copernican term with the Lacanian symptom, is to say that instead what makes us human properly, what makes us subject, is precisely that we don't know or cannot access this transcendental horizon. In other words, and this is a very radical thing to say, the very precondition of our freedom is that we don't know how to act, that we are lost. As Hegel once said, as soon as we speak, we are doomed. As soon as we exist in the world and we interrelate with others, we're lost to a continuous dependency on the socio-symbolic formations we have with others. Of course, that's not the language that Kant uses. That would be unnecessarily existentialist or perhaps even structuralist if you emphasize the language part. Instead, for Kant, freedom thereby becomes something which has as its own nature something which makes it seem distinctly unfree. Think about it. This is like, even on a very schematic level, you could argue like this. If Kant says that we access the transcendental other, the transcendental horizon of pure knowing, of truth, the light outside of the Platonic cave, he says at that exact moment, we would no longer be free. We would simply be the passive subjects of some kind of a priori truth. However, the very necessity of freedom thereby emerges as the problem of freedom. Namely, freedom is not the freedom to do whatever you want, Freedom is the burden, the properly subjective burden of having to decide what it is that you want to do with your freedom. And this is where we can add the classic existentialist twist on this from Sartre, which is that the formula of existentialism is not simply choosing what to do, but choosing what to do with what has been done to you. And from a Kantian perspective, what has been done to you is that you exist in the world of phenomena. You have no access to kind of noumenal reality. There is no noumenal subject that exists on the sort of purely ontic level of knowing itself. Therefore, we've actually made a radical move away from the Cartesian cogito, if you will. I mean, on the one hand, it's a continuation. I think, therefore I am. But you could add a twist in Kant, which is, I think, therefore I don't know what I am. I don't know what I am for, what I am doing here. And Kant actually adds a theological element here as well, where Kant essentially says that if we knew what God wanted from us, then we would no longer be free. We would be compelled to do exactly as God wills. And yet, the very notion of freedom and acting in a manner that is befitting of the deity for Kant is precisely in not knowing. That lacking the certainty of what God wants from us, we therefore have the properly human responsibility, which is therefore a moral question, as to know how to act. Now, this presents two problems. On the one hand, we have the moral problem, which is if we need to act in a manner that we think is befitting of the moral good, which can be either the highest good of the deity or the collective good of the people, which would, even going back to Plato, be therefore a reflection of the highest good, then how do we decide? Who do we follow? Like, who is going to tell us how to act? How do we learn how to act? If our very freedom is the freedom to choose how to live, then who do we follow in choosing how to live? You can already see here that a certain paradox ensues, a very constitutive paradox, which is that we are therefore trying to solve the problem of our freedom by means of making ourselves unfree on behalf of a conceptual other, someone we follow. To put this in crass terms, one of the pleasures that a lot of the people who follow Andrew Tate must therefore experience is the sort of the satisfaction of having some leader figure that they can follow, someone who gives them a kind of blueprint for how to act. And this isn't exclusive to Andrew Tate. I was at the airport the other day, and there was a man reading a book called The Bezos Blueprint. Now, I didn't know that Bezos had left architectural designs for his rocket, so I'm assuming that this is a blueprint for success. And the blueprint for success essentially says, here's a figure that we associate with great financial wealth, and here's how you can do it too. Now, instead of mocking the person who's reading this book, we should realize that we all face the same predicament, which is in choosing how to act, we necessarily look towards how others have acted, and we have to make a choice as to whom we would like to follow. Here we can find Kant's maxim that man is an animal in need of a master. And I want to look at that a little bit more closely. Now, when Kant says man is an animal in need of a master, he's actually not saying something as simplistic as, what differentiates us from the animal realm is that we need rules. This is actually something that you see within the John Wick movie. If you watch like the second, third, and fourth John Wick movies, a theme that is repeatedly discussed is the notion of the necessity of law and order, the necessity of rules. And that what distinguishes us from the animal realm, at least according to the logic of the high table, and we'll get back to in a moment why that's important, what distinguishes us from the animal realm is that we have rules and that we follow them. However, what's really interesting in the John Wick movie is that these rules are never simply imposed. Each and every time that there is a rule, the rule is stated, and then the characters are put into the position of a forced choice. In other words, they have to embrace the necessary illusion of enacting their own free will in order for the rule to truly thrive. Usually there's some form of blackmail that occurs to make them act in a certain way. If you don't kill this person, we will kidnap your daughter. If you don't kill this person, you will, like, there's usually some coercive mechanism underlying the rule. And yet fundamentally what's key is that the key authoritative mechanism isn't simply top-down brutality, but it is forcing the subject into a forced choice, by which it appears as if they have chosen of their own volition. You can actually see this also in another interesting, I think very interesting movie series, which you probably know, called Squid Game. In the hit Netflix series Squid Game, around, I don't know, the second or third episodes, there's a key moment in which the participants in the deadly game can choose to exit the game. And this is crucial because a majority chooses to exit the game. And yet in the next episode, most of them choose to re-enter the game. Now, the circumstances that drive them into this choice are not circumstances of their own choosing. It's extreme poverty, desperation, etc. However, what's key here is that we undergo a subjective shift from the assumption of I am here because I have to be here towards I am here because I have chosen to be here. And this is one of the ways in which true, authentic power works. It never makes you feel like you are being oppressed. It makes you feel like you have assumed your own oppression, that you are the active agent of participation. However, when you look underneath the surface, you realize that it was never a real choice to begin with. It was a forced choice. This is also, you will recognize this part of Žižek's critique of ideology, where he says that one of the things that happens within contemporary life is that we're given the illusion of increased participation, increased freedom, increased access to luxury goods, and so on and so forth. But the parameters within which we get to choose between what can be chosen amongst, in other words, to actually create new and interesting choices, is increasingly shrinking. Therefore, the very narrative of being someone who fights hard for his work and his family and to pull yourself up from your bootstraps and so on, excuse me, becomes a kind of necessary fantasy, a supplementary ideology that you have to tell yourself, because the unbearable reality is that you were forced into this because there is absolutely no safety net. There is no sense of a collective social system by which you could afford to do otherwise. And so you become part of this ideological regurgitation, which old school Marxists used to call ideological reification, by which you essentially have outsourced the exploitation to yourself and rebranded it as your own freedom. I've talked about this in other classes. This is very similar to the Nietzschean idea that the best way to enslave somebody is to convince them that they are free. If you look online today at many of these self-help influencers, this is exactly what they do. They convince you that you are special, that you are free, that you are taking action on your own behalf. And what's key here is that to some extent, it is true. You are free, but free within a system that allows you virtually no input as to how you would actually conceptualize your freedom. It's a kind of pre-cooked TV dinner freedom that you are receiving. And so this is why imagination remains a revolutionary act, not simply on the level of let's color in multicolored pencils and be hippies who have lots of imagination, but that imagination is precisely being able to see through how what appears to you as freedom is often simply a forced choice with a prettier mask. Now, to go back to Kant essentially says that man is therefore an animal in need of a master. No one can escape this necessity for Kant. In order to be free, we have to orient ourselves in the world, and we have to find a role model, someone we follow, someone we can trust. However, this is where Žižek actually has a very interesting and I think worthwhile Lacanian addition. Žižek says that Lacan's twist on Kant is to say that secretly what man wants is a master who you can dominate or who he can dominate. In other words, it's not simply truly following a master. It's not simply the pleasure of having someone who tells you exactly what to do. It's the pleasure of finding a master where you remain secretly the master of the master. Look around you today. That is exactly what's happening in the world right now. Your iWatch that's giving you prompts as to whether or not you should be walking more steps, or something software on your computer that's telling you to stand up once an hour. That all the little ways in which we have masters that are of our own choosing are masters that nevertheless allow ourselves to feel like we are master over them. And so we get to have this, we get to have our cake and eat it too. We get to be the masters who are dominating others, but we are dominating our own master. Here we have like an interesting twist on the Hegelian master-slave dialectic. One of the ways in which you can look at the master-slave dialectic is that the master never fully assumes his own enjoyment of being master. There is always, in some level, the burden of being master, of having to make the responsible choices. Whereas the slave, despite his misery and lack of agency, has a twisted form of happiness or pleasure because he doesn't have to make those choices. It's like the parent-child relationship. The parent has the burden of responsibility of being the master, and the child has the relative freedom of living in a world in which the master is essentially God. There's therefore a kind of naive, childlike bliss that exists in the slave mentality. Hence also why we surround ourselves with trainers and nutritionists and people we can call who give us mental health advice and various forms of software that check in on us. And we're surrounding ourselves with masters where we can enjoy being their slaves. Now, what's key here is that we shouldn't say, oh, the secret to liberation is to get rid of these false masters and to assume the true role of master, because then you would be unhappy again. And so one of the things that contemporary life allows us, which I think is also a key feature of capitalism, is that it allows us to be both master and slave, to assume the pleasure of our own outsourced slavery, whilst also enjoying the pleasure of pretending like we are our own true masters. And this is a particularly contradictory state of being that we pretty much all experience right now. Now, back to Kant. Kant is therefore not saying that man is simply distinguished from the animal realm because man has rules and man needs a master, and that if we therefore no longer have masters, we would succumb to a kind of anarchic bliss. Instead, the argument is a little bit more complex. The argument is to say that man, in order to access his freedom, has to make himself unfree. There's actually a great Chesterton quote about this. There's a Chesterton line where Chesterton says, I need to get it right. Chesterton says, every act of freedom is an act of limitation. And it's a great line because essentially this is true, right? In order to act freely, in order to do anything, in order to exert yourself, an act of will requires first everything you're not going to do. This is almost like a business pop truism that you have to have single-minded focus and that you have to cut the things out of your life that you don't want to do, and so on and so forth. And yet, from a philosophical perspective, there's a certain truth to it, which is that freedom is nothing other than elevated habit. That when you have learned to dominate yourself, you have therefore become your own master. Hence, freedom, in a sense, is simply no longer requiring an external master because you have become your own master. You have learned how to dominate yourself. Now, you look at that and you think, well, that doesn't seem like a particularly liberating sense of freedom. And this is because once you have learned to dominate yourself comes the properly moral decision, which is what do you do once you know how to dominate yourself? Because now everything you do is a genuinely morally infused act. You can't blame somebody else. You can't say, my boss told me to do this. You can't say, I'm simply a soldier following the general's orders. Once you have become the master of yourself, once you have essentially enacted your freedom by setting your limitations, the responsibility is yours alone. And so from a Kantian perspective, there's two conclusions to be drawn from this. One, freedom in its purest form is abysmal. We cannot deal with it. It's totally traumatic. The idea of acting freely, independently from others, is therefore the same as, if you want to put it in psychoanalytic terms, a form of psychosis. essentially, full direct identification with the idea of your own agency. Instead, freedom emerges relatively by means of your relation to others, how you act for others, how you act for yourself, how you act with others, how you learn to act by following in the footsteps of others, imaginary and otherwise. And the crucial step, therefore, is to learn how to treat yourself as your own other. Essentially, turn yourself into your own master, thereby cultivating your own limitations and enacting your own freedom. Now, be that as it may, Žižek has a twist here, of course. Žižek says that from a Lacanian perspective and from a Freudian perspective, even this mastery of self, the self-mastery, always relies on a necessary illusion, a kind of necessary exterior ground that has to be maintained. I'll give you some examples. Žižek has a characteristically crass one. Žižek says that you can imagine a young man who's, living his, has a sexual awakening and is participating in hedonistic orgies and whatnot. And yet in this man's head, the figure of his mother has to be completely pure. In other words, the man revels in his own sexual liberation, and yet will be properly traumatic, sufficiently shocking as to undo his hedonistic enjoyment, would be the suggestion that his parents might have done the same. In other words, the seeming freedom of the man to enact all of his sexual passions is secretly sustained by the necessity of the purity of an other, the purity of the parent, the purity of the mother. Something similar happens, for example, within religion. Again, Žižek argues that you could imagine somebody who believes, who is a devout, ardent believer, who is relishing in the full subjective bliss of his belief. And yet, there is always an element in which this belief is sustained on behalf of the non-believer. Think about how, like, certain Christians, they don't even try to convert you. They'll just say something vaguely patronizing like, I will pray for you. And this I will praying for you thereby becomes a kind of surplus enjoyment for the believer. And so Žižek's argument here, which is therefore a Lacanian psychoanalytic one, is to add to the Kantian maxim about, becoming your own master, that secretly our enjoyment, our freedom, nevertheless has to be sustained by some imaginary other, that we are devout believers in a weird way on behalf of all of those who don't believe, that we are reveling in sexual passion on behalf of the purity that we maintain in our heads about our parents, and so on and so forth. You might even argue that the criminal, in a sense, this is like a Hegelian inversion you could add, that the criminal acts out because the criminal secretly believes in the rule of law. Think about it, the very ethos about like the film noir criminal is therefore precisely someone who secretly believes that the world is just, who secretly believes that there is an order that he is, running away from or fighting against. That therefore it's precisely the heretic who is the true believer in some sense. Now, what's crucial here about this argument that enjoyment has to be sustained by an imaginary other is that this other is, in a sense, strictly speaking, imaginary. And the manner in which the imaginary is sustained becomes symbolic. I'll give you like a very psychoanalytic way of depicting this. The relationship between a father and a son, where the father believes that he has to be a certain type of parent. And so he acts as if he were stronger than he really is. He wants to be the good father. In other words, his relationship to the son is overdetermined by an imaginary notion of what fatherhood requires. However, as soon as this happens, this means that we have the symbolic relationship between the father and the child. The child, therefore, is the child looking up to the father who wants to become or not become like the father. However, the secret here is that the child secretly knows that the father is not perfect. And so the child upholds the illusion of perfection for the Father. And so we've inverted what appeared to be a totally normal heteronormative structure, which is to say the father is a good father to raise a good son. Instead, the father has to be a father because otherwise he doesn't know who he is to the son. The son, taking pity on the father, pretends that he is a true father, thereby enacting the symbolic relationship of the son. In a sense, you could therefore argue that the symbolic relationship is symptomatic to the imaginary one. Now, from a Lacanian perspective, if you've wondered what the real is in the sort of well-known triad of the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real is the kernel of necessity underneath this, which is a fancy way of saying that secretly there is no essence to father and son, apart from perhaps the strict biological one, that this impossibility of fully making compatible an a priori fatherhood to an a priori sonhood is precisely the essence or purity of the father-son relationship. In other words, what makes it work is precisely that it is broken, in a sense. Now, we can relate that back to the Kantian idea of freedom. The Kantian idea of freedom, therefore, finds its real in the notion that there is no freedom without its own restriction, which is mirrored in the fact that there is no freedom without its own impossibility. In other words, that the very horizon of freedom emerges to us on the level of not knowing how to act and therefore having to make ourselves unfree so as to become free. All of this we can put against the backdrop of the Kantian argument that if we truly had absolute knowing or transcendental knowledge, that we would simply become puppets, that we would become unfree. That's interesting because a lot of people recently have been talking about AI, artificial intelligence. And the question for artificial intelligence is always, when does it know that it is conscious? Not when do we know that it is conscious, but when does it know of itself that it is conscious? And then the question becomes, what is the difference between being prompted to act and an autonomous decision to act or to speak? Because these AI tend to be at this point linguistic in nature. Now, the key Kantian insight here is that strictly speaking, we cannot determine between the two. That it is neither a totally a priori necessity by which the machine thinks of its own volition and speaks what it wants to say, nor is it simply that we are telling the machine what to think. Instead, in a properly dialectical way, we are inching closer towards the authentic problem of consciousness, which is that the computer itself cannot distinguish between an authentic expression and something which was prompted by us. Of course, in characteristically historical irony, the way in which this makes itself manifest is by its mirror image, that we cannot truly tell if what we are putting into the computer is being properly interpreted by the computer or not. What's key here for Kant, though, to go back to morals, is that if this is the problem of freedom, namely that freedom and necessity are not simply opposites, but two sides of the same coin, namely freedom is a realization of your own necessity, almost like the Sisyphusian idea of, Sisyphus is happy, then the same is true, strictly speaking, for good and evil, for the idea of morality. That good and evil aren't simply antithetical to each other, that good is not simply the mere absence of evil, but that good and evil are the same thing in their alternate forms. I'll give you an example of this. I was watching The Mandalorian. There's a great scene in The Mandalorian where we get to spend a lot more time in the Republic and with the bureaucrats working for the Republic. And there's some characters working for the Republic who have received amnesty. In other words, they used to work for the Empire. Now they work for the Republic. And essentially what we see in these episodes is that the Republic will do distinctly evil things that have their counterpoints amongst the Empire, except the Republic says, we are not the Empire. They're overdetermined by not being the Empire. And so they'll continue the same practices. Like they'll have something which is like essentially like a mind-flaying reprogramming device, like a brainwashing mechanism. But instead of saying this is an evil device that will brainwash you and reset you, ha ha ha, Instead, they say this is something meant to induce pleasant feelings of harmony that will make you more complicit to seeing the way of the Republic. And of course, here we have liberal ideology at its purest, which is evil with a human face. And it's beautiful to see, therefore, that we see in The Mandalorian how the Republic is essentially the empire with a human face. And the dawning realization of that can, of course, and this is crucial, can only be seen by those who worked for the empire. However, if you revert the canon a little bit here, you can also understand that, strictly speaking, the empire isn't simply this evil antithetical antagonist that decided to fight the republic. Instead, in a certain sense, the empire was always already the republic. That there's a certain moment at which the resistance or the rebellion or whatever you want to call it realizes that the republic is this. And so it has to be fought. I'm getting confused with canon here. I know I'm going to upset Star Wars fans, but that strictly speaking, the Empire and the Republic, whilst they may have different legal systems, are one and the same problem, namely the problem of how to rule and govern the galaxy, essentially. And that there's something almost weirdly honest about the Empire and its distinctly authoritarian overtones about law and order that continues to exist except becomes disavowed within the republic of everyone can be their best selves, and it's about harmony and peace amongst nations, and all the administrative practices of empire continue within the republic, except now they're done with a human face, or to put it in Star Wars lore, with a, I don't know, a there's more races with a more pleasant face. Now, again, from a perspective here, the good and evil development is therefore not simply strictly antithetical. Instead, we're almost back at this kind of Hegelian theory of evil, which is the assumption that evil is simply good, which believes itself to be absolutely good. And there's a beautiful line that I've quoted here before from the director and animator Hayao Miyazaki, who argued that in his films, there isn't really a division between good and evil. Instead, his films are about finding the good within evil, classic liberal tendency, right? The redemption of the villain character. But, and this is very Miyazaki, also the evil that lies within good. And of course, the logical conclusion to be drawn from this is that the very notion of a battle between good and evil is itself a kind of evil. That the very ideological underpinnings that require there to be an absolute other against which your goodness can be measured is therefore the categorical definition of what it means to be evil. Now, Kant, of course, does believe in good and evil, except Kant doesn't believe that it's a battle between good and evil. That, in a sense, good is to therefore properly assume the full burden of your individual freedom and the accompanying moral responsibility of your actions, whereas evil would become not fully assuming your actions and putting them onto an imaginary other. In other words, if you go back to the maxim, man is an animal in need of a master, in search of a master, the evil tendency is therefore the hysterical one, namely to say, I'm doing exactly as my master believes. Now, from a psychoanalytic perspective, the psychotic tendency, which is simply the identification with the master, is therefore to say, I am the master, but not I am the identification of the other master. That's complicated, so let me take it a step back. Let's say that you have a master, and you simply follow their orders blindly. Like you say, this is, for example, like within the Christian belief. Like, if God tells you what to do, is God telling you what to do directly, or is God testing you? This is the classic hysterical question. God has given me an order. Is God telling me to sacrifice my son so that I will do it? Or is God telling me to sacrifice my son so that I will not do it? What makes this a hysterical question is that you've already assumed the problem of your own subjective identity, apropos the deity. You're no longer in the psychotic stance of simply being the sword wielded by the arm of God, which is therefore the properly comforting one. Hence also why Žižek has his critique of a certain kind of Buddhist radicalism that became that became weaponized during World War II, by which we had the idea of Buddhist fighters who were simply automata working as the essentially as the sword, as the spear tip of the deity. Hence, we're also back at the Kantian problematic, which is to say, if we fully identified with the transcendental horizon of absolute knowing, we would become nothing. We would become mere passive automata, which would be abysmal, horrific. Instead, of course, when God says, you have to kill your son, it is neither a test, nor is it a simple imperative. It is precisely the problem of subjectivity itself, which is, how do I act in accordance with what I believe God wants from me? Is it an absolute maxim, or is it a test? This problem of not knowing is the properly subjective stance in which true freedom can occur. And therefore, for Kant, if you choose to kill your own son, you are still embracing an authentic act, the necessity of embracing your fate, which of course could be a scene in John Wick. We could easily imagine in John Wick someone, as we do see in the film, killing their best friend because this is the imperative that they have, only to realize later that it is, of course, a false choice, which becomes the initial gesture of revolution. A revolution, by the way, which is staged even within the transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament. In the Old Testament, we have the transcendental authority, the higher God in the sky, who tells us what to do. Well, after Christ on the cross, there is no overarching authority we can believe in who will tell us what to do, and we are faced with the full moral burden and responsibility of choosing how to act amongst ourselves. As a great, for example, if you look at Adam and Eve, look at paradise, there's two basic ways of looking at it, which is God wants Adam and Eve not to know. God wants to keep Adam and Eve in paradise where ignorance is bliss and everything can go on as it is. Then there's the Gnostic way of looking at it, which is to say, what if the serpent is secretly there to liberate Adam and Eve? That the serpent is not the figure of corruption, but the figure of wisdom, who's thereby presenting Adam and Eve with the necessary transition into subjectivity. Then there's the third, if you will, addition you could make, which I'm just inferring here, which is, what if it's precisely that God wants Adam and Eve to disobey him, thereby making the fundamental gesture of authentic subjectivity? In other words, if God told Adam and Eve to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, would it really be an authentic act? Instead, the authentic act is the act of resistance, the act of saying, I would prefer not to, and thereby eating the fruit. I realize I have to wrap up here, so there's a couple of strands that we should wrap up here. Now, you may recall, or have read about, I should say, Lacan's by now infamous retort to the protesting students of 1968, when he accused them of being hysterics who simply wanted another master. Now we can look at this in a slightly different light. If Lacan doesn't truly believe in the idea of living without a master, then in a sense he is correct. The ultimate act of freedom is therefore choosing your own master. And the revolting, and first of all, historically, there's no doubt that Lacan had a properly sort of elitist dislike of the student revolts. I'm not trying to suggest that he did not. But from the perspective of freedom, therefore, the horizon upon which the student's freedom could exist was therefore properly hysterical. Now, what's key here is that there's two forms that this can take. Either it's the hysterical protesting, by which you secretly expect nothing to change. Namely, I'm going to protest and have a sit-in and do all the things that make me cool as being a protester, but fundamentally, I don't think anything will change. That tends to be the predominant way in which protest happens today. Lots of goodwill, genuine, earnest desire for change, and yet a fundamental expectancy, or whatever, like expectation, better word, that nothing will ever change. That the participation in a protest is simply what one does. I saw a great TikTok video that was making a joke about this, about professional protesters who go to get Starbucks on the way to the protest, etc., which was not anti-protester. These were jokes that were coming from within the protest community themselves, which is key. One of the key elements of resistance is precisely having this ironic attachment to your own participation. Let's not forget that a key part of Jewish culture was always Jewish jokes that were distinctly, ironically maligning Jewishness from within. That one of the saddest things about the well, not the saddest thing, but one of the really sad things about the nature of debates on Semitism and anti Semitism today and Zionism is that we've lost the capacity to embrace the idea that anti Semitic jokes and ironic humor was precisely a mark of Jewish cultural and religious identity. That now we have to face it with a kind of earnest binary between good and evil, loving Jews versus hating Jews, etc., which is itself an obscene relic of the universal identifier of the Jew, which was always the anti-Semitic fantasy par excellence. That's a little tangent. Now, the point here is that when Lacan says that the students are hysterical because they want a new master, what he's saying is that they're not confronting the authentic problem of freedom. They're saying essentially, we want to protest against the master, therein finding pleasure, and we want to find another master who we can be more pleasantly oppressed by. Think today. Think contemporary consumer capitalist existence. Isn't this the predicament that we face as well? That when we, for example, want to ban TikTok, I say we here, but I mean when American politicians want to ban TikTok, the argument isn't let's be liberated from TikTok so that we can have great online freedoms and public open access platforms. Instead, the argument is let's ban TikTok so that we can be oppressed and spied upon by another company, but a company of our own choosing. Here we find ourselves in the same logic that Lacan had when he said that you are hysterical, you simply want a new master. Those who want to ban TikTok simply want another TikTok with an American flag planted on top of it. And so the state that we're in today is not the state of being an authentic master, nor of finding authentic other masters upon which we could base ourselves, but simply the illusion that we are replacing our masters, that we have become our own masters, the illusion that we are finding our own freedom. And that therefore, in a very old-fashioned, almost conservative sense, true freedom is precisely refusing to buy into these tales of your own liberation. That an iPad, as wonderful as it is not a vehicle for self-expression. That having sex with lots of people isn't really the expression of your true free self. That the freedom that exists within this is a kind of hysterical freedom. I am proving to you how free I am. And therefore we find ourselves in the distinctly childlike capacity that we are all acting out and behaving badly because we're trying to find what the limits are. And we're secretly hoping that some father or mother or godlike figure will appear to lay down the rule of law. And this is a dangerous state to be in, because it means that fundamentally we don't trust ourselves to lay down the rule of law for ourselves. And that is fundamentally what we have to do if we want to be free. That freedom is an act of self-limitation, not limiting others, not telling others what they can and can't do with their bodies. Freedom is an act of limiting yourself so as to know how to act and what to do, and to understand that this is not a pleasant experience. That genuine, authentic freedom is experienced as a compulsion to act. That as soon as you act as if you had no choice, namely not I can because I must, but I can because I cannot not to, that you have authentically become free. Of course, the revolutionary addition to this is to say that this is what all revolutions are. Genuine, authentically free acts that appear to us as historical necessities. Of course, we couldn't not act when it comes to climate change, when it comes to the encroaching authoritarian measures laid upon us and our liberties in our life today. And the question therefore becomes, for us and for future generations, what did we do? Did we simply revel in all of the freedoms that are given to us, the freedoms to be free to speak and free to have lots of sex and free to buy things and free to travel? Or do we insist on the important freedoms, which is the freedom to have the imagination, to ask ourselves the question, what does it mean to live, and what does it mean to live well for us and for each other? And therefore, freedom remains, to my mind, one of the most important problems within philosophy today. And it's funny because so often I get comments online that say something like, do you believe in free will? And for me, that question already implies a problem, which is, does that mean that I don't believe in unfree will? I'll tell you what I believe in. I don't believe that free will and unfree will are detached. I think that freedom is precisely paradoxically the realization that you had no choice but to act. I'll give you, I know we're going over long here. Apologies to Jenlene who edits these transcripts. There's a beautiful scene. It's the key scene in one of my favorite movies. It's called Force Majeure. And I mean here like the Swedish original, not the remake. Also in classic American tragedy to comedy. So the first movie was a tragic comedy. It was very dark, but funny. And then the American remake was like a flat out like slapstick comedy that took away the traumatic core, as if the movie was so traumatic that it had to be reimagined within an American ideological horizon. Now, in the movie Force Majeure, we have a family that goes on an alpine retreat, like a ski resort. And at a certain point, they're all sitting outside having breakfast, and it appears that there's an avalanche coming down the mountain. And everybody starts running away. They think they're going to be buried by the snow. And what happens in this moment is that the mother grabs the children and the father runs the other direction. In other words, in this key moment of anxiety, the father chooses to essentially abdicate his responsibilities. He chooses himself. The mother chooses the family. And what's so beautiful about this movie is that the avalanche never hits. And so the family is therefore faced, seconds later, with the knowledge that the father didn't choose the family, that the father didn't do the father-like thing. And this gap that they are left to fill in, namely, what does it mean to be a family if the father, in the key moment, chose not to act, is the problem of freedom in its most theatrical form. Which is when you are presented with a seeming impossibility of choice, avalanche coming down the mountain, that is when your action counts most. That is when, paradoxically, your unfree action, namely the preservation of life, there's an avalanche coming down a mountain, becomes the free act that matters most. And in this case, the free act of the father was to leave or abandon the family. And so freedom, authentic true freedom, emerges only on the horizon of what appears to be an entirely unfree scenario. I've mentioned this before. Žižek's example of this, which is quite beautiful, is he says, imagine that you are on the street and somebody in front of you passes out. Everybody else walks on except you. You decide to call an ambulance. Later, somebody asks you, why did you call an ambulance when everybody else just walked by? At which point you say, because I had no choice. That is the Kantian definition of authentic freedom. Du kannst, denn du sollst. You acted freely because you had no choice. Thank you guys so much. I'm so glad that you've joined me. That has been my lecture on freedom. Next week, we're going to be in New York City. So look forward to that. Thank you for all the well wishes. I'm taking my medicine, my antibiotics. My throat is starting to get better. I'm just so grateful that I get to do this. I really hope that this was helpful for you. I'd really appreciate it if you consider becoming a patron. As a patron, you can download all of these lectures as audio files or as an RSS feed, as a podcast. And there's a bonus podcast that I host every week after the lecture exclusively for patrons. It's super fun. I really think you'd enjoy it. So if you're hoping to get on board and support this project and implementing your learning and just being a part of our learning community, please do consider becoming a patron. I'll post the link, but you can also go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. Thank you guys so much. I will see you next week. And I do hope that you'll join us on Patreon because it is honestly a really, really enjoyable thing. And it allows me to really interact with you guys. And that gives me so much joy and inspiration. Thank you guys so much. I will see you next week. Bye-bye.